Okay. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce tonight's speaker, Alex Hodges. Alex comes to us from North Carolina, Eastern North Carolina. He informs us, which makes a big difference in North Carolina. You're either Eastern, Central, or Western, right? Kind of like
It
Virginia.
is important to clarify. Everyone
Yep,
asked me
yep.
about the time they went to Asheville and how great it was. That's all well and good, but I'm more likely to have gone to Asheville when I was growing up in North Carolina as I was to come to New York City. So a
Yeah.
little different cultures a little bit, but a lot in common. So
Yeah.
there's a
And
barbecue divide.
Alex has a bachelor's degree from the University of North Carolina in environmental science and a master's from Oregon State in natural resources. So, and Alex has been working in Central Park for 6 years. And
Almost.
when Regina and I and Ken started um, the Flora project of Central Park, I remember hearing about a guy named Alex who was just getting started in the Ramble in Central Park. And they said, well, he's really good. He knows his plants really well, very enthusiastic. And then a little while, year or two into the project, we started getting notices about these plants, like, oh, have you seen this Ipomea hederifolia? And Regina and Ken, you guys will remember, like, no, we hadn't seen that plant. And turns out it was Alex that found it, growing on a little fence someplace. And
Was there this year?
so, and then Alex made a specimen of the rare copperleaf that Eve Levine had discovered just south of Strawberry Fields in Central Park. And so that specimen will be getting into the herbarium. So um, after coming to New York City and getting established in Central Park. Very pleased that this connection made this connection, and Alex has the opportunity to share with all of you how he and his team in the natural areas are managing the natural areas of Central Park. Um, So, Alex, thank you very much for agreeing to speak to us tonight, and look forward to hearing your presentation. We'll take questions afterwards. So if you want to use the raise hand feature, should see that in um, should be down at the bottom of your screen. Um, So just raise your hand, or you can put questions in the chat and I'll try to monitor that as well. Um, so without further ado, Alex, take it away.
Yeah, thank all of you. Thank you, Daniel, for inviting me here. It really worked out for me. I just finished my master's program this semester, so this was part of this presentation was ready made to defend my final project. Um, Regina Alvarez is here. This is a lot of it. This will be really interesting for her, hopefully. It's I'll explain it at the end after I talk more about what it is we do in Central Park, at least more recently. But Regina did this really great study almost a decade ago in the park of the woodlands, the woody species specifically in the woodlands, and this is sort of a repeat of that with some changes that are pretty cool to notice. I mean, we all know that there's changes over the course of our hard work in the park, but this sort of kind of provides some uh, corroboration for that. So, without further ado, I'll get started. Just so you know, guys know, my camera is down here at the bottom of my screen. So it might look like I'm looking above people's heads, but hopefully you'll be looking at the slides most of the time anyway. I'm going to try to go relatively quickly through a lot of these, but if I go over something too fast, just note it and I'll get to it at the end. So yeah, this is a picture of Azalea Pond, taken this year in June, I think, or late April. I just thought it was a really great picture. Our manager, Eric Whitaker, is in there. Jerry Heinzen, senior denizen of the Ramble, and then James, our volunteer coordinator. There's a lot of other people behind the scenes in the natural areas. I just thought this was a nice sort of way to start it off. Some of this is stuff that's geared to another audience, so you don't need to be told that Central Park is 843 acres and sees millions of visitors per year. But in the natural, the park has become more and more used for nature appreciation, as you all know. I don't have the numbers here, but between surveys that were done in the 70s and 80s and surveys that were done in 2011, the reasons noted for people coming to the park as nature appreciation quadrupled in that time. And they're going to do another survey in 2012 or no, 2021, or depending on the depending on when the pandemic ends, we had another large user survey that we're going to do also, so we'll see if that changes. But the park's natural areas consist of used to be called the woodlands, but now including the North Woods, the Ramble in the center of the park here, and then Hallett at the bottom. Used to call it the woodlands, but the inclusion of the Dean Slope there by Balto, a native meadow, not a woodland, as well as the sort of inclusion of all the most of the park's water bodies, the mere, the pool, the lake, the pond. We decided to sort of call them the natural areas and sort of have a more cohesive management unit. It only takes up about 10% of the park's acreage. And each landscape has obviously, you've been around New York for any period of time, has gone through many changes in decades past. Through over 150 years, different periods of neglect and management attention. This is just a little fun slide, some old quotes about the Ramble from the Greensburg plan itself. Olmsted and Box mentioned that present growth consisting of sweet gum, spice bush, tulip tree, sassafras, red maple, black oak, azalea, and andromeda, etc., is exceedingly intricate and interesting. And many of these species you'll notice are still common in the Ramble today, even though there was quite a lot of change through planting and regrading of the Ramble. And of the north end of the park, from rebuilding Central Park by a large management plan spearheaded by the original head of the Central Park Conservancy and founder, Betsy Rogers. She says, a tree survey of the North Woods was made in 1873, showing that Olmsted and Box enhanced but did little to alter the character of the existing forest. They encouraged native tree species such as hickory, basswood, and beech, but also planted English ivy, honeysuckle, clematis, and other vines tumbling over the rocks, all of which are still there, tumbling over the rocks for the most part. Just a little bit of a highlight. Most people know, but a lot of people who come to the park don't realize how different the Ramble in the North Woods and even the Great Hill adjacent to it have a little bit of a different history. The North Woods and the Great Hill was much less changed from the original state of the park grounds, whereas the Ramble, I think I heard accounts that like 40% of all the effort in the park was spent in the Ramble. It was the first landscape that was finished. And it was really sort of the design focus of Olmsted and Box. So a lot of different changes in hydrology and whatnot. But yes, the woodlands have undergone different periods of neglect over the years, and during periods like the Moses era and others, there were a lot of reactive improvements that changed the trajectory of the park, including its forest species community. A lot of non-native species were planted, and some, not most of them, but some of them have become very common in the natural areas and are a source of constant effort, management effort, and consternation for us in the park. But that's becoming less and less a problem. So flash forward to modern woodland management, as I like to call it restoration horticulture. There are 13 of us in the natural areas spanning the Northwoods, Ramble, Hallett, and Dean. We sort of operate, we used to be considered gardeners, and I still kind of think that that is not a bad description of what we are, but we have a very different sort of management ethos when it comes to managing these natural areas. The Ramble, Hallett, and Northwoods are all designated forever wild sites in the city. So just that alone means that we try to put effort into maintaining these as wild spaces, but we also are trying to rewild them to an extent. This has all happened relatively recently. In 2011, the Ramble section was officially split off and created, which is sort of the first management crew dedicated to natural areas management. In 2015, the Northwoods and Hallett were formally added under that same management umbrella. And I believe it was 2018 that the Dean Meadow was added, even though the Dean was open to the public in 2016. Our staff try to use specialized, we need to have specialized knowledge in native and invasive plant species, but we also need to employ horticulture and arboricultural techniques to manage the landscapes. There's a lot of safety, clearance, line of sight, other issues that you have to take into account. Not to mention even certain aesthetic and sort of cultural and architectural values that we want to promote as well in the greater, within the sort of greater vision of the park. We also have a lot of interns and volunteers that are volunteers, especially, have been a lot more, have been slowly increasing over the past few years. You need good organized staff throughout the landscapes in order to take on volunteers, as we found. Now that we've sort of had that sort of sustained over the recent years, as well as another push from our volunteer department, we're able to really get a lot of our work done with volunteers. This is myself with some of my interns from a few years ago, back when I still got interns. This guy in the middle, Phil, he actually came back and works for us now in the Northwoods, and he's really coming along. I'm really proud of him. And these are a lot of our volunteers up in the north end of the park. This is Central Park North. That's where us removing a Manhattan euonymus patch to be replaced with a few different native shrubs, dogwoods and rubus. Just a little quick rundown note card version of what we do and how we do it. So the one thing that I like to note is that Central Park Natural Areas team, we do engage in restoration and ecological management, but we're afforded the ability to sort of do this on the micro scale. And we do it through sort of a sustained adaptive management strategy. We have had large, anyone who's an Upper West Side resident will notice the large capital projects that we've had in the Ramble, primarily to restore pathways and grading and drainage. But for the most part, most of our work gets done in small increments and sort of as the landscape can handle it in reaction to public usage, changes in that usage, and also, random stochastic events like storms. We sort of don't try to bite off more than we can chew when we try to make incremental increases. So we'll choose a site, we'll assess it. We're going to first work on the plants that we have there, mitigating erosion issues, invasive plants, especially any sort of continual disturbance. The landscape is being trampled or cut through or whatever could be going on in this area. We want to mitigate that before thinking about larger issues like planting, but also weeding and invasive species removal, mainly by hand, takes quite a bit of our time. We do use herbicide, but we actually been using less and less of it every year. And we only use it in places where we've had about 1,000 or plus man hours, human hours, that have not been successful in removing things like Japanese knotweed. So we do that. We spend about 1 day a year that we set aside for that, and our manager does it all personally. So, you know, we like to go from there to planting of what we consider primary hardy restoration plants, aggressive, or what we would consider aggressive native plants from the area, whether that be, you know, Virginia knotweed, whitewood aster, even pokeweed and things like that that most of the people in the park see as weeds. We view really as allies in sort of the shift from invasive species to native plant populations. We keep an eye on them. We regularly will maintain them. We have someone there noticing the landscape every day, just about. And then after a landscape is a little more stable, we will try to increase plant diversity with more secondary and rare species. This is just a little bit of the research. This is a great slide that our old manager, John Paul, put together years ago. This is just sort of a little bit of what's on our shelf at Central Park. In the middle there, those are really Central Park specific. Andrew Pogon put together way back in 1989. Sort of a great sort of holistic look at what Central Park Conservancy needed to do to restore and manage the woodlands going forward. And that's really sort of an undercurrent that we try to use going forward. We have other ecological evaluations. Once and Future Forests is a great book that highlights Central Park and other areas, urban parks and urban park restoration. Obviously the Marge Garzullo book, really helpful. And then our management plan. This right here is extremely important. It's a little bit dated, but it really kind of shows how the woodlands fit in with the restoration vision of the rest of the park. Publicly available, so I definitely recommend it. Of course, the Central Park Flora Project and other things with Daniel and Regina as well. Very informative for our work going forward. And this is a great photo. This was taken a year before I came. John Paul left a lot of photos that I could choose from. So this was about 2014. This is really illustrates how every square foot sort of counts in our incremental management style. This is, most of you will probably recognize Tupelo Meadow. This is an area that years ago was just sort of lawn. There was no land really dedicated specifically to plantings. The main issue though is that the lawn is not very well draining. It's sort of like a high wet meadow. There's a lot of bedrock underneath there. So anytime it rains or snows, especially in the wintertime, it's a very soggy area. So what's a horticultural turf problem turns into a smorgasbord of potential native plant sites. So we first called it the sedge meadow. We put a lot of native sedges and other wetland and sort of moisture-loving plants in there. You see the swamp milkweed and hibiscus, cardinal flower, and the like. A pretty big success story. So that was 2014. This picture in the top left, we decided we were going to expand the area into the continually wet area. another incremental increase. This is either late 2018 or early 2019 in the winter. More of our volunteers here. This is where we marked off the area. This is the summer of 2019 with interns, staff, and volunteers all working on planting. These are mainly divisions from plants throughout the rest of the Ramble that we're just sort of spreading back in here, but we also did have some plugs and some seeds, most of which come from the Greenbelt Native Plant Center in Staten Island, a really great resource for us. And this is what it looks like this year. Here on the top left, that's 2019, and on the right, it's 2020. So quite a change in a short period of time. Just to highlight the rest of our meadows, we have a meadow up at the 102nd Street Cross Drive. It's really popular birding location, one of my favorite areas in the natural areas. A lot of our meadows in the park, like the Tupelo meadow here, but we in the 102nd Street Cross Drive meadow, we even have a lot of sort of smaller edge meadows, what we call them. We try to maintain these herbaceous edges, and oftentimes what most bug people tell me, insect people, and I believe it, is that the idea is that we're creating a diversity of landscape. From a designs perspective, it can be helpful to sort of break up the line of sight, but also from a management perspective, it can break up that line of sight so that people are less likely to blaze a trail right through there. If you just had lawn next to a woods, it would be really inviting to walk into those woods. Whereas here we're providing interest for people as well as sort of a visual barrier and texture. So that's sort of a management thing as well. Of course, a fence doesn't hurt. But the idea is that we have these meadows adjacent to woodlands because most of the pollinators that people love and enjoy need woodland plants to complete their life cycle. Hickories and oaks and sassafras and spicebush all are nearby this meadow. So we think that really sort of plays a symbiotic effect. We manage our meadows every year. This is, I would say, late February, early March. We come in here and we do a big removal of all the porcelain berry we can. Turns out mowing does not remove porcelain berry. You need to pull it out by hand, so that we try to pick the most or the least damaging time to do that. So we do it right before spring when it can take the most disturbance. Most meadows only existed in the wild because of some sort of reason, whether that's grazing, a herd of trampling buffalo, or flooding, or fires. We don't have any of that, so we have to sort of provide a little bit of that disturbance by removing little saplings, maybe occasional mowing, and also removing of certain invasive species. This is the meadow in, looks like June. I've only got one photo of the Dean Slope in here, but we do have really good documentation for that, so maybe that's for another presentation. But the Dean Slope is by far our largest meadow, and it's come quite a long way. We have a lot we can say about that and the journey it's taken to get here, but we're really very proud of it. It's been sort of a laboratory for us when it comes to learning how to maintain meadows in different soil types, and yeah, it's been really quite a journey for us. So I mentioned planting. We do a fair amount of planting. We plant a good amount of stuff, but we really try to tailor it to specific locations, mainly just areas where we're removing invasive species. We focus on species that are native to within, it says here, 150 miles of the city. That's really to encapsulate certain species that maybe they're more likely to be found in upstate New York, or maybe they're more likely to be found in New Jersey. But for the most part, well over 90% of our plants are found within 50 miles of the city, if not within the city proper. We planted over 400 species since 2007. Many of those are species that we already had in the park, and we're just augmenting areas where we're removing a lot of invasive species and we don't want to leave a void. But this includes all sorts of different plant types. We use seeds, we use cuttings. You see here we have ball and burlap trees. We rarely plant those, but they were sort of bought for us for a larger project in the Hallett. So that was sort of a fun thing for us to do. So we really have, at our disposal a lot of different tools, but mainly it's small pots. Seeds for grasses we found are actually some of the best plugs for grasses, are more hit and miss, and other graminoids for the most part, except for sedges. But we like to stick to the small stuff and let it grow in on its own. We'd rather buy 10, little oak trees and have one of them survive than waste a lot of money on one big ball and burlap tree that has been babied in a nursery on Long Island for its entire life. This is just a little photo of all of us with it's like, this is our Christmas, when we get, this is a big order that we got. This is a great photo from this spring that I think really sort of encapsulates the restoration horticulture dichotomy that we have. This is Aubrey, keeper of the Tupelo Meadow now. We planted this tree together in the first week in April during the lockdown, and it was really sort of a, really sort of an uplifting thing for us. We normally don't plant really large trees, but they had this one left over and available, and there's other dogwoods nearby. So hopefully these will commingle and produce more dogwoods. And it's also, obviously for the aesthetic purpose in such a, highly visited area, dogwoods also provide great fruit for birds. So when it comes to we have a lot of canopy size invasive trees in the park, many of them, but we don't let it bother us. We don't panic. We do have a plan for it. We're actually, Eric and I were out with our arborist team creating this year's sort of invasive Norway and sycamore maple reduction plan, which basically just means every year we pick a few mature trees to remove and repurpose, either by leaving the wood in the landscape or using the wood for other purposes. This is a situation where there was a sycamore maple in the South Ravine landscape near the 102nd Street Cross Drive Meadow we just saw. We removed this sycamore maple, relatively small. We used it in a adjacent location, and we actually took and planted an oak tree here. This is actually a willow oak, technically native to the city, but only just. There is a population of mature willow oaks nearby, so it made sense for us to put this tree when we had it available here. What I'm trying to show here is that we don't just remove trees without lots of foresight and thought. We want to think about the trajectory. We mentioned that word a lot to our staff. Think about how the landscape's going to change over time. Removing a lot of trees can create sort of an availability of resources and a disturbance that can make things worse from an invasive species standpoint or from a park usage management standpoint. So this, I think, sort of illustrates how we're thinking about the future, not just removing an invasive tree. This is where we use that log that we just saw from the previous stump here to help augment our rustic trail system. We've been doing a lot of effort into revamping our trails. We've partnered with the Natural Areas Conservancy and sent some of our folks to sort of Skillshare there and learn about different trail management techniques. And a lot of people on our staff, including myself, have experience working on trails. So we can use these as sort of a natural regenerative way to help with the drainage and pitch water off the path and things like that, help with erosion. Here's another example of how we use these logs. So this is in the Hallett Sanctuary. We used a small log that we removed, a Norway and sycamore maple, I believe, that we removed in the North Woods. Brought it all the way down to the Hallett and used it to break up this really heavily compacted desire line in the Hallett. This is the bench at the top for those who know. This area got constantly used. It doesn't really look that bad in this photo, but it's the only one I had. We wanted to sort of break up the line of sight and the desire to sort of cut this trail, which was causing erosion issues. And we set these logs into the hillside. We planted some other species, and it's been pretty successful. So that's another example of how we use those trees. This is just a little example of some of our tricks for invasive species removal. This is a landscape that is in the North Woods. The last time I saw Regina, it was right here at this landscape. It was when I first started in the North Woods. I was faced with many landscapes such as this one. And John Paul and I, we sort of came up with a plan for it. You can see this is sort of early in the spring. Later in the year, this would be 6 foot tall knotweed. So it's mainly knotweed, but also wisteria, Chinese wisteria, and other natives like poison ivy. This is after we removed everything we could with a after-school program. The Roots program was a really great high school student program where we did sort of soup to nuts, beginning to end restoration projects with high school students. It was really rewarding. This is where we removed as much as we could. We covered it up in black plastic, which would normally serve as like, solarization is an effort that a lot of people use to kill invasive species without any sort of chemicals or disturbance to the soil. We couldn't really pull that off by just leaving black plastic exposed to the sun, which would basically speed up the respiration process, but with no light. So we just covered it up in leaves and sticks and wood chips and left it for a few years to sort of starve the knotweed. We came back a few years later. There was a little bit of knotweed left, but we were able to get most of it out. And this is the same site. And I apologize that this isn't the right time of year. I thought I had a better in-season photo. This location here is literally the same exact location as this one here. We didn't do an awful lot of herbaceous planting. We just did a lot of seed spreading. We took seeds from our meadow on 102nd Street Cross Drive. See a lot of asters. We also have other goldenrods and grasses, but this is a great example of this location after the fact. Huge flush of red oak seedlings. So this log here, we took down 2 mid-sized invasive trees, which we had left. We leave any species has a value unless we think we can improve the value of the landscape. We were leaving those trees because we knew we would essentially release the knotweed if we removed them. So once we felt comfortable with that, we removed those trees. We took them down to the Hallett. Those are the same logs you saw before. And now we've got a lot of sun in this location and a lot of seedlings and saplings. This is another example of knotweed removal. This is what most people who know it's called the lily pools, not really pools anymore. So this is before and after a one-time herbicide application. This area actually completely filled up with native species. Of course, the favorite annual plant, jewelweed, but also whitegrass and Pennsylvania knotweed and things like that. Virginia knotweed, rather. So this is the part where I talk about measuring change over the years. So we've sort of seen what we do. So if you have any questions and think I didn't cover anything, save those for the end. But I'm gonna try to go through my project that I did this summer and concluding this winter, where I did a survey of the park to see to gather a lot of data on the woody species of the park and compare it to Dr. Regina Alvarez's similar study from 2012. So Regina produced this great, this was actually her dissertation, and it's a great resource for us in the park. You can sit down and sort of nod your head along to a lot of the things, and it's interesting to see where we've come over the years. The hallmark of that is this project is there was one of the main parts of that study was a survey using the point-centered quarter method to do a woody species survey. I want to say the word woody species over and over again. We didn't look at the herbaceous species, which we have seen quite a lot of improvement on, and we spend certainly probably more of our time on the herbaceous species in the park. But it's interesting to sort of see these canopy and sort of structural species, and they're easier to measure on a quick basis. And so we have this great baseline data set from that previous study, with also insights into smaller, the sort of lower size classes. So you can separate these data sets to large trees, small trees. Where's the disparity there? What does the future of our forest look like when looking at these smaller trees and shrubs versus the larger ones? And using this as a sort of a template, I repeated this random sampling survey. I had a few differences in mine. I used a GIS program, QGIS, to create my random points, not plots. I keep trying to say plots. Instead of long transects, as Regina did. We took a few more points in the Ramble, just because we had the time, just barely, to do so, to see if that would make a difference. And then we also sampled the wooded areas of the Great Hill, which is not technically a natural area and is not really managed as such. There's certainly, in more recent years, there's been a lot more effort put into invasive species removal and things of that nature, but it just hasn't been like the North Woods just a few years ago. Just hasn't had the continual staff presence that to be able to sort of make this sort of concerted effort towards it, and it just hasn't been designated as such. So I wanted to see if there are any differences in a large woodland area that's remained a woodland for years, but hasn't been managed the same way that the North Woods right next door or the Ramble has. So this is a great sort of photo that I think encapsulates the story. This is one of the folks at the park, Mimi. She helped me a lot with the survey. She's standing next to what was once the largest red oak in the park, or in the North Woods rather. Quite a large tree. It came down on its own accord, not even that windy of a day. It's interesting. I actually don't shed a tear when this happens. It's, I'm glad that it came down on its own and we didn't have to take it down. It'll remain there in the landscape for many more years, providing habitat. But you can see that you've got in the foreground, this is Norway maple. There's a lot of Norway maple canopy here. So this sort of, to me, it sort of is a good picture that highlights the sort of anxieties that you might have in the North Woods if you didn't have a plan to deal with it. Regina's paper sort of showed that in the North Woods, there quite many red oaks, more in the North Woods than in most other landscapes. but there were not very many red oaks in the smaller size classes. They didn't seem to be regenerating very well for whatever reason, which was concerning. So in a situation like this, where you've got, this large red oak tree coming down with mostly invasive tree canopy, as well as obviously plenty of poison ivy, what are we looking at in the future, right? So we were there to find out. So I'll just go a little bit through my methods. Hopefully this makes sense to you guys. A lot of walking around in the woods, staring at this GPS unit, which was pretty good. It worked out pretty well. The idea was to have as little bias as I possibly could. So we used the point-centered quarter method, as I said before. This is a situation where you don't really use plots like most random, simple random sampling methods. You use points instead. It's a little bit faster because you're only sampling a finite number. You're going to go to a site or go to a point. You're going to divide it into 90-degree quarters, and the closest woody plant in each quarter is measured. So there are only 4 species that'll be measured, and they have to reach they have to satisfy the size requirement of 1 centimeter, which Regina set years ago, and it really is useful because we get to sort of parse out the differences between those smaller trees and the larger ones. So basically, it's pretty simple. We go to the site, we measure the distance from the point to the tree in the quarter. In centimeters, we measure the diameter of each stem. If it was a multi-stem tree, I converted that to a basal area equivalent of DVH, because really the only point that we're trying to gather is basal area anyway. And we recorded the species, and as it says here, we can get a lot of interesting information off of this, such as density, or how many trees or woody plants are there in a given area. Frequency, this is per species, so you can say, given this species, how many of our plots is it found in? That can give you an idea of how dispersed a species is, or how clustered it is. And then basal area, or cover, some people call it, just the general size of the tree, the area of the cross section of the stems, is also a valuable tool. I found the random points with QGIS. If anyone is interested in mapping, I suggest, years ago, I took a few GIS classes in school, and I tried out this program called QGIS, which is a free version of ArcGIS. And when doing this project, I was like, I should give it a shot. QGIS has come a long way in the years. It's almost the same thing as ArcGIS, and it's free. So I'm sort of an evangelist for this program now. It's really easy. You can see the North Woods up here with the Great Hill adjacent to them, Ramble in the center, the Hallett below here. This little light green part is the Dean. We took this many points. I'll try to speed this up and I won't explain it, but we took about the same in the Ramble and in the North Woods. We took 42 in the Hallett, which was a lot more points per area, and 96 in the Great Hill. This is a visual representation if you're good at squinting. But maybe you can see here, so each landscape I buffered around pathways about 5 meters, and then I used a function to drop random points of a given amount within the landscapes. What's important to remember is that Central Park and the Conservancy has all of our landscapes in the park are delineated with ID numbers, area, treatment. I mean, we have all sorts of information tied to these ID numbers, and this started from way back in the beginning of the Conservancy to help us manage our trees. We have most of our trees GPS located, but I didn't use any of that information. I wanted to just go off of information in the field. We took these precise GPS delineated landscapes, and I didn't want to be dropping my points next to on a path or right next to one, because my GPS has a margin of error of 5 meters. So I used that to make sure I wasn't going to be trying to find trees on a path or on a lawn or things like that. So this is a sampleable area here. And I made sure each point was further than 5 meters away from another one to avoid sampling the same tree twice. So we didn't sample any tree more than once, which was really great. There were a few times where that was going to happen and we threw out a point, but it was a lot more rare than I thought it would be. So the method worked pretty well. And I wanted to ensure that we got really good spread throughout here. These are all randomly dropped. So the larger landscapes with less surface area to area ratio are going to have more. But you can see here in the Great Hill, much of the Great Hill is not really considered woodland. It's more meadows, lawns. Some of these are horticultural areas, a little bit different than other spots like the Ramble. This is just a quick rundown, so you don't really need to. I'll explain it for you. Basically, this is just something I thought was interesting. The Ramble, Northwoods, Hallett, and Great Hill are all different sizes, and this is the area of land that is actually classified as woodland. It's not a lawn, it's not a path, it's not a wood chip area. This is the actual woodland area, which is about 2/3 of the whole area. We say the Ramble's 38 acres. This is really only about 20 some acres here, 9.4 hectares. After buffering away from the path, we're only left with 1/3 of that amount in the Ramble, which basically means about 1/5 of all of the 38 acres in the Ramble is not within 5 meters of a path or is a path. It's very highly broken up versus the Northwoods, which has, this is the sampleable area. 50% of all the area was sampleable in the Northwoods, only 35 for the Ramble. The Hallett's an interesting story because there are paths in there. So I don't think it's quite the same effect, but Northwoods is a bit in the middle. But it's interesting to think about what area I'm actually sampling because I want to avoid edge effects that we can have in the woodlands. So when I did all this analysis, I found out that very reliably throughout all landscapes, there was a density of about 2.2 meters, or a distance of about 2.2 meters from the point to the tree. That distance can translate to a density value if you take certain things, if you take some assumptions. But for the most part, that shows that 2.2 meters from a point, we're going to have a tree. My buffer distance was pretty good. And also, we do a lot of management near the path for sight lines and other things like that. And we didn't want to have the data be skewed by that. So we wanted to focus more on that interior woodland area. These are the tools I used. The cross, the little PVC cross there is for placing next to the point so that I can sort of visually delineate the 90-degree quarters. In each one of these quarters, you can see here, you go to the nearest tree that's at least 1 centimeter at breast height, measure that distance, measure that diameter, record the species. This is like a small tree that's just not big enough for the survey. So it's pretty simple going out there. I used this metal stake. I would go out in the field to find my points, which are on this GPS unit, try to put on blinders, and as soon as the unit got to where my point was loaded, I just stopped. And then I drove in the stake so that once I started measuring, I wasn't tempted to move my point at all. So I made sure to establish the point that way in the beginning to avoid any biases. So this is the sort of workout. This is the finding the point, the stake, the 90-degree quarters. Normally I would put this a little bit even closer, but I oriented it to north always to avoid bias in that scenario as well. And then you go to each quarter, measure the trees, and leave. It didn't take too long. We were averaging, 10 minutes per point in a lot of scenarios. Of course, that doesn't take into account travel time and everything else, but it was pretty quick. We use rulers and also calipers to measure the size of smaller trees. It's measuring the distance there. And this is what you get. This is a little, yeah, a lot of effort and data cleaning goes into producing this. This is just the top few species from the natural areas data set. All the acers and vegetalists and whatnot. This is all very valuable data on abundance, density, density, DBH, percentage sampling units. From all this, we can sort of see each species within the greater community on sort of a granular level. And then from this data, we can also produce these importance values. So these are sort of created values. So I want to stress that we're not saying that one species is more important than the other one. We don't want to be saying that. So let me see here. So we use the importance values are created by these three separate values of density, dominance, and frequency. We can figure out absolute values of these from these numbers. But what we want are the relative values as they're related to the whole. So out of all the trees, what percentage of density, dominance, and frequency do we have? Density shows what percentage of the number of trees are black cherries. Dominance says what percentage of the size, basal area of trees are black cherries, which we'll find is quite different. And the frequency is a value that shows how spread out are black cherries, which we know if you walk around the woods is quite, they're everywhere. And we combine these two values, which are each one of a percentage value, so between 0 and 100, and we get an importance value between 0 and 300. We can use these to sort of rank the presence of a species in community. We don't want, for example, if we just looked at basal area, you would get the idea that oaks are just really the most important by far species. But we know that black cherries are really common and they're really spread out. So this is sort of a value that sort of mediates those three values and sort of explains them a little bit more in a greater ecological sense. So this is a little bit of a recap of that previous study. 1,200 species, black cherries were by far the highest ranked importance value. That isn't really going to change much for this one, spoiler alert. And the Prunus genus was ranked highest of all genera. Oaks were second. However, there were certain issues with oaks in certain landscapes lagging in the recruitment sizes or the lower sizes. And in the top 20, there are a lot of non-native species. Not too many. There were 9. White mulberry, Norway, and sycamore maple were, by far the top ones, and that petered off after that with certain horticultural species like the cork tree, the Chinese scholar tree as well, which I'll talk about it later, but we sort of manage them a little bit differently. So there's sort of a reason that there's so many of them there. They have horticultural value. They're planted on purpose. They're in prominent areas of the Ramble. So we don't go out removing all our 110-year-old cork trees. We love our cork trees, but we do manage their spread. In the lower size classes, certain species were a little bit underrepresented. Invasive species, there were some relatively highly ranked ones, more so even in their average rank. So the number one species of the saplings that we found were Norway maples. Sycamore maple were a little bit further down. A lot of good doesn't show all the good things, all the good species in there, but it's something of note considering there's such a high management focus. So what did we find this time around? The too long didn't read version is, but you're already invested. So you already read most of the story. Is that there were pretty good measurable positive changes. If you see positive changes as increases in diversity and a decrease in presence of invasive species. We want to remove a lot of invasive species, but not at the increase of overall diversity. Or that, obviously we want native species to be a higher percentage of that. And we saw some things that we've all been noticing, especially I know Daniel's been noticing this and telling us about this. There were some increases in select non-native species. This, don't get a headache looking at this. This is the list of all 119 species that we found in the natural areas. There were about 120 some species overall, if you include the great hill, but we didn't include that in here. A little bit of differences over the years. If you like squinting, the black cherry is still #1 up here in importance value, with the pin oak, red oak close behind, American elm, and the hackberry up very high. And even the #6 of all across the woodlands or natural areas was the arrowwood viburnum, which is pretty interesting, and so on and so forth. This is another tough slide to look at, but it does. If you had time to look at this and really look through it, you can see that here in bold are your diversity metrics. So species richness is just the number of species we found. That went up from 82 to 119. We did take a good bit more, about 20% almost more sample units. So we sampled more, we're going to find more species, but we found a little bit more percentage-wise than we would have thought we would have found given that. The Northwoods or the Ramble rather went up from 50 to 84 and so on and so forth. Each one of these landscapes increased in diversity. The Hallett, I was very surprised that we got 41 species and we only visited 42 points with 4 individuals per point. So that was a lot more than I was expecting. But we've done quite a lot of planting of all the landscapes. We've probably had more planting in there than the rest. So that's by design that we have that many species. These color codings within each block showed just differences, relative differences here. So yellow is not always bad, but it just shows relative differences within this area. So on the bottom, we have the original Alvarez study. And on top, we have the current value. So Shannon index, Shannon evenness, which we can take from the index, which is sort of a ecological evenness value. Simpson index. These are all diversity indices. Modern ecology realizes that there's many kinds of diversity beyond just these sort of metrics that we use in richness. We want to think about genetic diversity and structural diversity and all that. In certain really, rich landscapes in untouched, faraway areas might not perform as well as a vacant lot in Florida, but that doesn't mean it's any less diverse in certain senses. So I want to put that in perspective. But for the most part, we saw large increases, or at least noticeable increases in each one of these. I didn't perform all of the proper statistical analysis that I needed to on this, but I'm pretty sure if I did and had the time, not being a statistics major, most of this all would bear it out true. So The Simpson index is just basically the bigger the number, the more quote diverse it is. We saw a pretty dramatic increase there. There are increases all around, and I'd just like to sort of bring into account the Great Hill, which was sort of lagged behind in basically every area, which we kind of would have expected, given that it's not managed as a natural area, but it's sort of interesting to see that. I actually went back and created a new spreadsheet where I did this. I broke it down with only native species. I didn't include it in here because I didn't want to have an even more difficult to look at slide. But when you take only native species into account, in some of these scenarios, we're still in really good shape. The diversity of native species increased quite a bit, and there was a big difference in the value of the Great Hill when you took only native species into account. These landscapes held up much better in these values when we removed non-native species, which count towards these diversity values, than the Great Hill did, which was interesting. This is just sort of a little look at we have these importance values, which take into account not just number of trees, not just size, not just spread. It's sort of a mediated value. What percentage of this was native? So of all species, about 70%, I don't have it here, but about 70% of the species number were native, but 78% of the importance value was native, meaning in general, a lot of the non-native species we had were sort of unique species with only a few individuals, or they just didn't show up that many times in our plots because we've been managing for them so much. The Ramble is actually pretty low here of all the natural areas. And that is mainly due to the fact that there are a lot of big cork trees. So that sort of shows, even despite all those large cork trees, it's still a pretty high number. The Northwoods had the highest percentage here. And the Great Hill was significantly lower. This is a top 20 list, then and now. The non-native species here highlighted. Still a lot of good stuff at the top, still a lot of the similar things, Quercus palustris, Quercus rubra, American elm, and the like. But on the right-hand side, there's some cool differences. You'll notice here, Malus species, these are crab apples, mainly Malus hupahensis tea crab apples that are naturalized in the park. It feels like to me, I mean, I've only been in the park for 6 years, but it feels like there's a lot more of these things. And indeed, that's true. There are more of them than there were last time. They were down here at number 18, whereas now they're all the way climbed up to number 8. So we don't have a completely antagonistic view of crab apples in the park. In the holistic sense, we view there. We know that they have ecosystem value, but it is sort of a issue of concern, and we do more actively thin them now in preference for other native fruit-bearing species, whether that be dogwoods, hawthorns, or other similar shrubs. These green ones are new native species that have popped up in the top 20. The top 3 here are really interesting. The black gum and the red maple had shot up a lot, whereas the sycamore maple went from number 3 down to number 10. And all these other guys, besides the cork tree, fell off the top 20 list completely. The cork tree and the crab apple, which is really impressive. Sort of gratifying to see that borne out on paper after all the data collection. For example, I think that the ranking now for sycamore maple here is like 47 out of, so that's pretty cool. And it's interesting also to note that with this sort of a drop off in Norway maple, we have a sort of concurrent rise in red maple. And that actually shows up for all the other maples in the park, including sugar maples. Basically just red maple and sugar maple for the most part. The rest of our maples are pretty low in number. Down here, I'll just make a little caveat. The black oak, I did find a few large specimens of black oak, mainly all besides one that was in the Ramble in the North Woods. And it was really exciting because it fit all the descriptions of black oak. So there were a few black oaks up there. That's mainly due to a few larger individuals. In previous surveys, black oaks haven't really been thought to be a species that reproduces in the park. And from my experience, we find very few black oaks that seem to have reproduced in the park, despite the fact that there are mature specimens up there in the North Woods. There are a few that I think came in on their own, but for the most part, we do plant black oaks. So the majority of the small sapling black oaks in our city were planted. And we had a few large specimens that we were able to get our hands on the buds and the acorns. But if you were to look at these papers side by side, they would probably be very similar grouped into the red oak. If you were comparing Regina's and my papers, which none of you guys can. I had to take my word for it. So here's some takeaways. Black cherries, they're still ranked #1, but they're no longer as dominant. We don't, black cherries were noted in a lot of previous surveys, every survey. It's known within the park. We've never planted a black cherry in Central Park, and it is the most common tree. And we really like it in the natural areas. It's one of those aggressive native species that can live despite, and maybe even because of disturbance like trampling and all this compaction and everything else. And birds love them. That's why we see them everywhere. But they're it sort of seems like they're losing their dominance over time to more traditional canopy species like oaks. For example, if you look at just the genus values, oaks they really leapfrogged cherries, even though we had increases in ornamental cherries, as I saw here, or Asian cherries, sort of a species complex of different sort of flowering cherries, like Prunus serralata varieties, which have increased. They're beautiful in the springtime, but they have increased similar to crab apples, but not quite as obviously, especially in the Ramble. Even with those increase in ornamental cherries and other cherry species, that wasn't enough to push the cherry genus up above the oaks. The oaks were very heavily ranked. So oaks in Central Park are thriving, it would seem. Black tupelo, this is a really interesting thing. It wasn't sampled at all in the previous survey. And to be honest, there's only about 20 or so mature black tupelos most of them in the Ramble, a few of them in the North Woods. We didn't find one in the North Woods. All the ones we found were in the Ramble. There's a lot of really nice old specimens, especially Tupelo Meadow, for example. But the reason our numbers went up was not because we got many of these large specimens in our survey. It was because there were all these young saplings underneath of them. And we found so many of our landscapes were just full of these young tupelo saplings, whether they be root sprouts or from seed. A little bit of our theory is that decreasing the disturbance, the trampling and compaction, fences are working to keep people from trampling the understory, as well as the concurrent removal, minimization of Japanese knotweed. We're getting a lot of regrowth underneath of these old black tupelos, which makes it much more likely for them to show up in our samples. Sassafras, a similar sort of clonal almost species, increased quite a bit. Red maple, mainly in the Ramble, but also in the North Woods, increased pretty obviously. And In a lot of scenarios, most of this was from what we saw as natural recruitment and not planting. And sugar maples actually increased quite a bit. We've done a lot of planting of sugar maples. The vast majority in the natural areas of sugar maples were planted. A lot of them million trees program saplings that are coming into maturity, likely leading to the increase in importance value. They went from rank 26 to 23rd, but they actually doubled the number that we found. The basal area was almost double. The frequency value was double. Just because they didn't change the value much, there's a real increase in sugar maples, which is important because that's a species that you don't really see as the future of the New York City region because of climate change and whatnot. But when you look at the Great Hill, as I'll show a little bit later, they're actually thriving. Ash species are also very prevalent and increasing in the understory. They're really prominent in the understory, which is interesting given that emerald ash borer was found last year for the first time in Central Park. We hadn't found it until last year. And we find some here and there. We do treat about 70 mature ash trees in the park, but there are far more than that in the park. And we're sort of straining our time and budget to be able to treat that many to try to inoculate them against the emerald ash borer. It'll be interesting to see if these, these lower size values stay in years in future studies. And also, decrease in invasive maples. Japanese Angelica tree is still an issue. Showed up less in our study, but that doesn't mean we need to take our foot off the gas there. One thing that I didn't really realize until the end was that we didn't get a single glossy buckthorn, multiflora rose, jet bead, or winged euonymus in the natural areas data set. And these are all species that are less likely to be captured in our data set anyway because they're smaller, shorter. So even if you're standing right on top of one, it might not fulfill the measurement requirements. And there are certainly some of these left. But it was really gratifying to see, oh, we didn't get a single one of those. We did get some in the Great Hill, though. This is, I'll not break it down too much further since we're getting short on time here. But if you look at each individual woodland, the Ramble has the highest overall diversity, greatest by far decrease in invasive maple canopy species. It's really dramatic. With a concurrent increase in native maples, as I said, increases in the ornamental cherries, black gum and sassafras, relative unchanged in the cork trees. But as noted before, the cork trees you don't really consider them invasive, even though they're considered an invasive species. We haven't really noticed super invasive tendencies, so we haven't gone after the mature trees as such. We'll cull the young trees instead. Northwoods, highest presence of red oaks and oaks in general overall, with a really positive increase in recruitment or the smaller size class, which was heartening. There was had the highest continued presence of invasive maples. It's the only landscape that has sycamore maples of all the ones we saw, but sycamore maples decreased dramatically and Ora maples increased by over, there's less than half now than we had before. And the ranking dropped from 3rd to 5th, I believe. In the Hallett, the dominance, sorry, I don't know what's going on with my computer. The dominance value of black cherry decreased significantly in the values of buckthorn, classic buckthorn, and jet bead, which are really common in there. We put in a huge effort to remove these before a lot of the capital projects. We got a full-time gardener in there, and I think that was really what did it. We had a good run of gardeners there, and they really put the hurt on some of these species. And we also saw a dramatic increase in diversity along with that. So let's go through the Great Hill, or at least the wooded areas around it, beloved by Upper West Siders. this is a little bit of a look at our sample area. These are the sort of the rocky sort of cliffside areas. And these are sort of a rich sort of mesic slopes here. A lot of this is sort of these interesting meadows that were created during different storm events. This is just a little bit of a picture of what you're going to see in early spring in the Great Hill. The wonderful mid-sized leaning black cherry you'll see throughout the park, but also a lot of issues with compacted soil, a lot of, not nearly as much understory density of saplings, a lot of multiflora rose, but also here's some sugar maples, as well as elms. Elms were very dominant in the Great Hill, more so than in other landscapes. And sugar maples actually have the best grove of young sugar maples is in the Great Hill by far. So if you like sugar maples, the future is bright in the Great Hill. This is sort of a picture of the Great Hill. This is what a lot of the North Woods looked like before, still does in some areas. This is the first week of knotweed growth. It's already gone 1 foot. It'll be 6 feet tall, and you won't be able to see these outcrops. Makes it hard for a lot of native species recruitment to happen. This is just a little mixture of all the best stuff. Of course, you've got elms, but you've also got sycamore or Norway and sycamore maples, lots of multiflora rose, scarlet mustard throughout. So when we looked at the data, we found that it was behind, as I said, in all these diversity values, lower percentage of native species overall and importance value. And the list goes on with the highest presence of invasive maples. One thing that was really interesting is that when you look at a survey from about a decade ago, and you look at the values of the North Woods when it comes to Norway sycamore maples, these are almost the same rankings as those values in the North Woods were before, which was funny because that means that, wow, you could look at the Great Hill and think these numbers could be changed really quickly in 10 years or so, right? We can make that argument. And even though we saw a large increase in crabapples throughout all woodlands, it was by far the highest in the Great Hill of all the landscapes. So it seems that our efforts in the woodlands have, like, to sort of mediate the spread of those a little bit, might have been what caused it to be lower than here in the Great Hill. It was the only landscape with multiflora rose, jet bead, winged euonymus. It was interesting in that whereas the top two genera and species are normally an oak and black cherry. Throughout all three spread out woodlands, natural areas in the park, that was not the case in the Great Hill. The number one genus was maples, and elms was second. Elms were actually number one overall in species. Sugar maple was really highly ranked here. A lot of young specimens, and I believe it seems like it's going to slowly climb the ranks and be a dominant species. This landscape has probably the best stand of mature American lindens, basswood trees. In this area here, there's quite a many basswood trees, and it sort of creates almost a contiguous grove into the North Woods here. This is actually called the Linden Trail. We call this trail the Linden Trail. It goes all throughout here. It's really great stand of linden trees. We do see some recruitment of lindens in this area. It's noticeable. But when we look at the Great Hill, I don't have the chart here, but there's of all of oaks, when you look at that lower size class, so when I say lower size class, we're looking at the the quarter. So if you have 100 trees that you sampled, and then you order them all from smallest to largest, and you take that the first 25, the first quarter, that's our lowest quarter, our lowest size class. So looking at that quarter, we didn't see but one oak or linden tree in that entire data set, which was, that was, I didn't really expect that. Thinking back on it, we didn't see very many of them in the landscape. It seems that oaks and lindens, which are really dominant in, there's some really great examples of oaks and lindens in the Great Hill. They're just not reproducing very well in there, which is concerning. And Norway maples were ranked #1 in that size class, just like they were in the North Woods in the last survey. And when you look at it even further, the North Woods ashes were really highly ranked overall, and especially in the sapling sizes. There were extremely few ashes, extremely few viburnums, which are common in all of the other landscape, native or natural areas landscapes. So that was interesting to note the differences there. And the North Woods just across the drive there has a lot more. Interesting why that is. So, just sort of a general recommendation is, we could treat the Great Hill more like a natural area by monitoring erosion and trampling issues, maybe formalizing some trails to make these trails more desirable and to perhaps decrease random dispersed off-trail trampling. Of course, we would like to have a more concerted effort in removing invasive species and promoting the existing native species, which there are quite a many there. Planting would be great. But from what our data shows, what I sort of got out of this study was that planting, while it did drive up a lot of diversity numbers, and it shows when you're out there in the field, a lot of the biggest changes were just due to sort of management shifts that affected natural recruitment of species like oaks and perhaps ashes and sassafras and black gum and things like that. And also, there's the potential that invasive species over in the Great Hill can spread to the North Woods. And, even vice versa, you want to make sure that we don't have seed sources anywhere in the park. We want to have like an overall sort of cohesive management plan across landscapes for some of these species that are problems no matter where you are, like multiflora rose and the like. I will note that vines seem to have been pretty well taken care of overall, considering the workforce in the Great Hill. A lot less vines than you would expect. Invasive vines, rather. Plenty of poison ivy and other vines. So there's a lot of, some overarching conclusions here where we increase overall diversity while decreasing the diversity of invasive species. And we've got more regeneration of native canopy species. And so, repeating this study, hopefully, I was really lucky to have had Regina's study right there, really well laid out for me to be able to sort of take it and run with it, and then find out something 10 years later. I think it would, hopefully, with these two studies available, it'll make doing this type of thing 10 years from now, every 10 years, even easier. So hopefully it sets that precedent. Yeah, and of course, there's so many other ways we could study the woodlands, not just by looking at certain sizes of native species or woody species. In conclusion, finally, if you were waiting for this, I've gone over by 3 minutes. Should have checked my watch earlier, but this is not everyone, but it was the most recent picture of everyone looking happy. This was taken, I mentioned to Daniel earlier, the first week of March or the last week of, maybe it was February, late February, really before we were all freaked out about the pandemic. So, it's kind of interesting to see how far we've come. And, we did this, this study. I had 9 helpers come and help me because I wanted people to see, buy into the process, and everyone sort of could feel like they were part of it and understand the process. So most all of these guys in the gray shirts helped me out. But there's also a lot of, all-star volunteers in here that help us. A lot of Upper West Siders helping us out. So hats off to those folks who made it all happen. For that, I will open it up. I'm sorry that I took so much time. Yeah.
Alex, that was terrific. Thank you so much for sharing all that great work that you guys have done. Super interesting. I know that all of this, what you found out about the natural areas is going to be take a while for us all to digest it and to, but I know that it's going to be important for the way we explore the park, for what we see in the park, how we share with other people about, what's going on in the park. So super helpful, interesting information. Really appreciate all the work that took to produce that and your presentation tonight. So do folks have questions? You want to just unmute yourself and you can ask the question directly. You can put it in the chat and I can ask it for you. Either way. I know we have some folks left. Well, I could start out the question. I noticed that you had Aesculus flava and Aesculus glabra, which are horse chestnuts.
Yeah.
And those have only just recently been escaping in New York City. Were those from cultivated trees? That's the smooth horse chestnut and the Ohio buckeye, the yellow chestnut, neither one of which are native to New York City area, planted, but now are starting to escape. And so the ones that you found, were those escaped?
They were planted specifically by our planning, design, and construction team during specific restoration efforts.
Oh, okay. So
Some
they'll
of them,
probably,
yeah.
they probably will be showing up in your just as spontaneous individuals for too long.
Probably. There are quite a many of them outside the woodlands, but these particular ones were, they seem to be like one-offs. So we haven't planted many of them in there, or they were planted before we got there, before the North Woods was included with the Ramble and the other woodlands. So it'll be interesting to take a look at those. They're actually in a really rich landscape already of the North Ravine. One's the North Ravine and one's in the South Ravine. I think the Ohio buckeye was north and the horse chestnut was in the South Ravine. That one was sort of a remnant tree, the horse chestnut. But the buckeye was planted more recently, it would seem. Maybe like 10 years or 12 to 15 years ago. So there's quite a lot of canopy in there. And it's an area where, we've got a lot of other competing native species. So it'll be interesting to see, to monitor those. I wasn't aware that they were naturalizing around the city. I know they're planted pretty often,
Yeah, Aesculus flava is doing pretty well up in the Bronx River Forest, just north of the NYBG. Big population of naturalized trees. Also, Pelham Bay Park.
Bronx River Forest, similar to the ravine. So,
yeah, that's what they like is rich, moist, shady woods. They germinate in the understory. So,
well, that's perfect spot for them. So we'll keep it a lookout.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Any other questions?
Yes, I have a question. Hi. Thank you very much for the wonderful talk. And I'm also aware that the ashes are very, very abundant in the as young trees in the North Woods, and it seems like there's a good amount of diversity as well. Quite a good, and you may know that one of our members of the team here discovered the pumpkin ash in the
Yes.
North Woods. Yes. And so, but also, can you just describe to us where you saw the emerald ash borer and what it looked like and what we should do if we were to see anything?
Well, the emerald ash borer, it's funny. So if you were to see it, you can alert one of us. Is probably the most practical thing. Not everyone you see is going to know what you're talking about. They might not be aware if they're groundskeeping a certain other area of the park. But our tree crew team wants to know about it, and they do. They do. You will find them on young trees. So I found some. I'm not going to switch back through all the slides and point it out, but one of the main ones we found was near Diana Ross Playground. Is just one example. We found a few of them there. We honestly we monitor them heavily, and we have not been finding like that they're throughout all the ash trees. I don't know whether that's because we've been preemptively inoculating them, if that's been helping. But I have been finding on young trees in the North Woods a little bit near the edges of the drives. I don't know if that's because they're more able to locate ash trees that way. So there's this one little lawn near the east side of the North Woods, sort of across from a path near coming up from the conservatory garden. If you were to like come out of that steep path and cross into the North Woods there, near the Andrew Aswell Green bench, I found a few. I found a few smaller trees that had definitely had all the galleries, and we even found a beetle in there. Now, it wasn't throughout all, or a larvae in there. We haven't found a beetle yet, but that was probably one of many ash trees that were around there. So we're sort of just waiting with bated breath over the next year or two before it sort of explodes. Who knows if that'll happen? But I'm glad you recognize that we have so many ash trees in the North Woods. The pumpkin ash, that's a really cool find. We were close to one of them in our survey in the ravine, but we didn't get one of those in there. But you can really see, I'm from the southeast, so near a swampy area, like I said, in North Carolina, and there's the Carolina ash and pumpkin ash down there in these swamp forests. And you can really, I wasn't really sure it was a pumpkin ash before, and now looking at their aspects, it's really interesting to realize, oh, of course that's a pumpkin ash, because of the way they buttress sort of at the base, and it'll be a real shame to lose those species in the ravine because they really sort of hold the floodplain together there. But we're cautiously optimistic about ashes in the future in comparison to what it could be. We have a plan. We certainly have a plan. There will probably be some ash trees that make it into the future, but who knows how much effort that's going to require.
Thank you very much. And just to follow that regarding the American elms, because I've been so surprised, it seems to me that there's quite a lot of young growth of American elms, and it seems, I wonder what that means. Does it mean that the elm disease is improving? Or I understand that the elm disease does allow young trees to develop to a certain age, but do we have any awareness of where things are standing with the American elm disease? And
yeah, so they're really common sort of natural recruit throughout the park. They have no problem reseeding. A lot of the mature trees that you see, mid-sized trees, are kind of cultivars, like Princeton elm, for example. That doesn't mean they're immune, but they've made an effort for certain landscape trees. Like we're going to be replanting some elms at the mall this winter, for example. We try to choose cultivars that are theoretically more resistant. The main reason that the main state of the affairs and of elms is that we're all on full alert for the signs of Dutch elm disease, and we're pretty good at spotting it. The first sort of dry spell early in the summer, late spring, or really summer, you're going to see it, and we're going to remove, I would say, between 10 and 30 trees a year. Now that number sometimes is pretty low. For a few years in a row, you could remove 8 or 12 trees, but the last few years we've removed over 25 trees both years, which sounds like a lot, and it kind of is a lot, but we have so much regeneration that would be interesting to see, like over time, our mature tree data set, if that number has like steadily decreased. And I don't know whether or not it has anything to do with sort of the like root grafting in certain areas of the park. I know the North Woods has been losing some big elms the last few years. They're very common trees. We remove about 20 plus of them per year, and we grind the stump whenever we can to keep it from spreading via roots. And we do still plant them, but we really try not to plant them unless it's in like a legacy area, like the mall, for example.
Thank you.
I don't know if that answered.
Oh yeah, thank you. Wonderful.
I have a question.
Kevin has a question. He had his hand raised already. Sorry. Kevin? Kevin, you want to unmute yourself?
Can you hear me?
Oh, I heard you for a second there. I think you're muted again.
You're still muted.
All right, I think I'm unmuted now.
There you go.
Thank you for your presentation. It was fantastic. I've witnessed lots of cutting downs of the American elms this summer, and I was particularly interested in the one. Are you familiar with the Triplets Bridge area?
Sort of, but
That's
not,
the Virgin Naturalist Walk.
Yeah,
That's south of the yard.
Yeah,
I'm familiar with it, but it's not part of our area. But yeah.
Okay, but it's kind of a good question in a sense. It was a very big elm, and in a kind of like a small area, and it had to come down. It got wrecked in a storm, and half the tree was like split in half by a windstorm, and they had to take it down, and now the whole landscape has changed. And I was wondering if you would probably let the area just regenerate on its own, or would you try to replant new trees there?
I would be doubtful that new trees would be planted, but you can continue.
Oh, no.
Yeah. For that area, I'm not certain what their plan is. So this area of the park is called Naturalist Walk, which is interesting. There's a lot of species that are planted there that you would not have in the natural areas. But it is quite a well-maintained horticulturally area, depending on which spot you're talking about. I believe there's pumpkin ash in that same area.
Yes.
It's a really natural, it's a really interesting area. There's quite a lot of work that was done in sort of the late summer to remove those trees. But I'm not really certain what the plan is with the area when it comes to planting it, but I'll certainly monitor it more closely because that's something that is really crucial with what we do in the natural areas. Monitoring landscapes after large disturbances. You know, for example, all of these large capital projects where we went in there and removed the old paths and put in new ones and regraded it, like that's a huge, painful thing to witness if you're gardening this area or, you know, restoring it. But it would have been so much worse if they had tried to do that 30 years ago without all the effort that went into reducing the seeds in the seed bank and all that. And you're talking about an area that there's a lot of the key species there are like non-native species. There's a lot of English ivy there. There's also interesting other native species there as well. I think there's like a good population of golden ragwort there. So it's really interesting, great bird watching location. So but my guess is that they're not going to plant a tree there, but I can inquire further about that because it is sort of near to our natural areas and our water bodies.
As a follow-up, is there any, I've noticed that I think I've seen, like, personally witnessed, like, cutting down like at least 5 American elms. And I was just wondering if there's any plan to replace, like if you have to take down an elm tree, like an American elm tree, is there any intention of replanting some of them in the future?
Yeah, so we try not in natural areas to replant them in a woodland area because we do get a lot of natural recruits. But also we plant about 10 a year, probably less than we take down every year in landscaped areas. So if it's on Fifth Avenue, if it's in the mall, or if it's a particularly prominent tree in a horticultural area, you will replace it. But currently the tree replacement plan is in flux, and it's sort of on an ad hoc basis. So if it's a tree, you know, in the natural areas, we're not really so concerned about replacing any given tree because we want the landscape to be more adaptive, and we're going to encourage the native species that are there. Oftentimes there will be elms there. But when it comes to the rest of the park, and, you know, maybe someone else could chime in who knows as much or more than I do. We don't have like a out goes a tree, in goes a tree sort of calculus. Really, we sort of wait and see if it's necessary. Because a tree coming out is going to change the nature of the location, and it's going to be 30 years before this tree becomes what you want it to be. And sometimes you need to let the landscape sort of become something else while that process happens. But for the most part, we do plant American elms, but because of their management effort that it requires, those species are less planted than we plant more beeches, you know, we plant white pines, we plant things like that. Whether or not those are better trees to plant than elms is an open question, but we plant them because it's easier for us to manage for them. Even the beeches, for example, we have a plan for those. I don't know if that answers your question.
Thank you for your talk. Fantastic.
Go ahead, Elizabeth.
Hello, thank you for being here this evening. My question has to do with the role of evergreen trees in these natural areas. I'm still becoming more familiar with the way a northeastern forest looks, having lived in places with many more evergreens for the last 40 years. But I noticed, there were some white and black pine listed in your list and some juniper. I didn't have a chance to read carefully while the list was up. I didn't notice hemlock in that list, but I wonder what the plan would be, whether it is to encourage more evergreen, or what type of role does it have in your forests?
That's a great question. And, I've lived out west too, and I moved there particularly because of the pines and the evergreen trees for the period. So out here, it's a little interesting because there are a lot of evergreen trees in northeastern forests, but Our experience with them in the park has been really like a love-hate relationship. You know, we really like promoting these species, and we do put a concerted effort into it from a design and aesthetic standpoint as well as an ecological standpoint. But they just don't seem to enjoy living here. And if you look at some previous surveys, you will see evergreen trees, but you know, if you look at the original survey, I love to go back to the original like 1857 survey of the park's grounds before all the construction went on, sort of taking stock of all that was growing there. And you don't see white pines. White pines are on the list, but they were planted near residences. You don't see generally many pines at all. There's no hemlock. There may have been hemlock on Manhattan, but you know, certainly it wasn't very common like it was up in the Bronx. So it's interesting. We did actually capture in our data set one hemlock, which I did not think would happen. So we have probably 6 of them planted in the North Woods. Adelgid is sort of a minor problem. It hasn't become a major problem on them yet. I don't know why it hasn't been worse issue, but because of the Adelgid, there's a lot of theories as to why evergreen trees don't like to live in urban areas, but for the most part, we have pines throughout the rest of the park. Like the Austrian pine, for example, there's oh man, I can't believe that I'm spacing on the fungal pathogen, or maybe it's bacterial. There's basically a limiting factor for like Austrian pines as well as to a lower extent other pines. So we do plant them. We have more success with pitch pine, which is not really the sexiest evergreen. We have, you know, if you include rhododendrons in Ericaceae species, you know, that's another species that is actually a species that was extremely common on the grounds of the park. Years, you know, before the park, there were blueberries everywhere, huckleberries, but for some reason there aren't as many anymore, and that could be a change in hydrology, a change in, you know, mycorrhizal associations. I'm not sure. Maybe less fire. Who knows? But even rhododendrons and azaleas are a little bit more difficult to coax along. We have some great ones, mainly horticultural like Asian varieties in the Hallett, but also in the Ramble. We've got some great azalea diversity. But especially things like mountain laurels, which you see, you know, 10 minutes drive upstate everywhere. It's tough to get them to grow in the park, and they're certainly not reproducing.
Is that possibly related to pollution?
It could be related to pollution. I don't know enough about the biology of it. Some people think that, you know, the fact that they don't drop their leaves really regularly, like deciduous trees do, maybe that's a factor that they're accumulating, you know, pollutants in their stomata or something. But that's one possibility. But you know, you can see in this photo we've got lacebark pines here doing very well. So really depends on the location. Certainly they're not reproducing all that well. We haven't found, it's really rare for me to find a pine seedling, and they don't last long. I don't know if it's because they're tasty for little critters, but yeah, don't really have a good answer for you there. We have juniper also, which is sort of common to this area, but it's a little bit more common sort of south and a little bit west of us, I guess. Maybe on Long Island, sandy. I think it likes sandy or more well-drained soils. But juniper is probably the most successful species that we have, native.
Thank you. Don't take a mindset to look at the forest without pine trees and view it as healthy.
Yeah, it's funny. Olmsted pointedly wanted to grow evergreen trees. I mean, thousands of them were planted in the Ramble. If you look at old like data sheets, and they all must have croaked. Whether it's because they can't handle compaction in the root zone, or you know, certain, you know, there's a lot of potential reasons, but yeah, it's true. They look a little, forest looks a little barren in the wintertime.
May I add something to that, then? I'm so glad Elizabeth asked that question, because I've been noticing in Riverside Park that there are holly trees and yew trees, and as excellent winter evergreens, and how incredibly valuable they are for the winter birds. I never realized that they love to stay in them at night in the winter time, large groups. So I was wondering, do the yew trees, do you think yew trees and holly trees were originally part of this landscape? And we have native species of them from this area, as far as I understand. And perhaps they would be good too.
Well, you point out, you really filled a gap in my response there. I would have to say that of all the evergreen trees that we have in the natural areas, the American holly is actually the most successful. We actually have been seeing many instances of this tree regenerating. When I say many, I mean like, you know, maybe like 20 scenarios where we've seen little holly trees. You see them out in Long Island. You see them throughout coastal plain areas, as well as sort of more hilly areas. So of all the native evergreen trees, I'm not certain. I know that they were found in the original park survey. I don't know exactly how common they were overall, but we have some really great specimens in the Ramble and some pretty good ones in the North Woods that are reproducing. And they're in other holly species, like, you know, deciduous hollies, for example, the winterberry holly, that is by far the most desirable berry for birds in the early winter by far. That doesn't last very long at all. So I definitely recommend planting those. They're not going to be providing food in the middle of the winter because they're going to be gone. We plant quite a bit, many winter berries. They're just not evergreen. And then you mentioned yew trees. There are like native yew species to the Northeast, but they're not really, most of the yews that you see are a European variety, I believe, or maybe an Asian variety as well. They're really excellent urban trees, urban plants. As far as I know, they don't reproduce often, so they're not really invasive. But we have them in the natural areas, and we don't really remove them. We don't go out of our way to remove them necessarily, but they're very slow growing. They're part of the landscape, but we're not going to go planting them because they're not native.
I think I recall seeing a lot of very young American holly trees, or tiny little plants, in Hallett. I think I also saw them a lot around Strawberry Hill. A lot of them had, I guess it was a leaf miner. I don't recall, it was about 2 years ago, but they had a lot of damage to the leaf from some insect. Perhaps that is inhibiting their taking over again.
I do believe there's a type of rust that we saw once, and then there is a leaf mining insect that hits them every year, but we haven't found that it's super problematic. They do replace their leaves more often than you would think. So they can withstand some, you know, herbivory like that. We have certain species that get completely defoliated in the late summer, like a lot of our dogwood trees or shrubs, and they don't seem the worse for wear. It's just part of the, you know, that's just part of the natural landscape. But the Hallett does have quite a good selection of holly trees there. In strawberry fields also.
Mm.
Okay, well, I guess we should wrap it up. Don't want to take up your whole night. This is the longest night of the year. Happy solstice, everybody.
Daniel?
The shortest night,
Yeah.
Daniel.
Can I just jut in a
No,
little
the
bit that
longest
I wanted
night.
to say that Alex, that was fantastic. And I'm so excited that you did this. And it's
Yeah.
really, really exciting to see the positive changes. Daniel and I talked a lot about that with our paper, and it was really good to see all the positive changes, in data. We've talked about it anecdotally for so long, like everywhere we restored an area, we started to see the oaks grow, but it was really good to see your data and to see all those invasives drop off the top 20. I was very happy to see that.
Well, it means a lot to hear you say that. I just want to tell you and everyone that a lot of the impetus for this was a lot of stakeholders, including people like yourself, people in the park, new employees, other people, other coworkers in the Conservancy, even people like higher up in the Conservancy who all, care about the same mission. It's hard to really explain to people exactly, to really quantify, to be able to quantify these changes was really gratifying, because you have folks who work tirelessly at these. They feel like they're chipping away at this one little thing, and are they really making any difference? And if they haven't been there long enough, they might not think they really are, but they, this really proves that it is a difference. And we have a lot of volunteers and a lot of dedicated step. We put a lot of time and dedication into it, so it's not going to be applicable to every 10,000 acre plot. But I just think it's sort of a good example of how like continued sort of stewardship and love of the landscape has sort of translated. So
And
thank you, Regina.
that statistic that you showed in the Great Hill and how it very much looks like the Northwoods 10 years ago was just really telling, I think, also. So
Yeah, so it worked out. Like I went into this project hoping to find. I mean, I was nervous. I didn't know if it would be like obvious, especially with comparing like the Great Hill and the Northwoods. I sampled the Great Hill first, and I did the Northwoods sort of later on. So I didn't really get to like see it in real time. So I was kind of unsure as to how it would shake out. But it really just was pretty obvious, pretty pretty clear. So it's not rocket science. It's just a lot of work. It's a lot of effort. And I went to every one of those points in those landscapes, and that's just knowledge right there is useful. So
is there a way we can see the total species list from the park of the woody species?
well, the total species list of woody species is much bigger than what I found, but I can send you some of these data, or I can send to maybe Daniel or somebody some of these graphs just from what I found in my study. It's not comprehensive. There's probably, we got 119 species, and we've probably got well over 200 species if you include shrubs and even vines. So that you just want to keep that in mind, but it would be really interesting maybe for people to just see what were we finding out there overall.
Yeah, that would be wonderful. Thank you.
Jill, you can get the total species of the wild plants in the park from our paper in the Journal of the Torrey Botanical Society. It's published open source, so it's completely for free. So you can just Google Flora of Central Park, Torrey Botanical Society. You get the whole list, the whole paper.
Thank you so much.
It's really great. By the way, that paper was really cool. We use it every day. Compare it to our notes, so someone can think, oh, I found a new species that isn't on this list. I'm sure we'll come up with that. You could find species. We're there every day, so if there's one there, we'll find it. But it's a really great paper. I was excited to get my hands on that.
Okay, well, thanks everybody for joining us. Remember, next month we'll meet on Monday the 11th, second Monday of the month. We'll have James Lendemer, lichenologist, speaking. That gives you a heads up. The EcoQuest challenge for January is going to be on lichens. So, get your hand lens out. Okay.
That's very funny.
All right, everybody. So it's great to see you. Thank you, Alex, again for
Daniel.
speaking.
Thanks.
Fantastic.
Really
for having
enjoyed it. Yeah.
Congratulations.
Okay. Bye, everyone.
Thank you,
Good night.
guys.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thanks for having me.
Happy New Year.
Yeah.